My name is Neelam. Today we discuss unit number 5. Chapter name is Reproduction. Lecture number 29, class 10th, and your topic is Sexual Reproduction in Plant on page 78. Sexual reproduction in plant involves the production of gametes, sperms and egg cell and their fusion, that is fertilization. Gametes are produced in special structures in plant body. The major plant groups are mosses, ferns, and seed plant. The seed plant include gymnosperms and angiosperms. Plant groups use different methods for bringing the sperms and egg cell together. In mosses and ferns, sperms are motile and can swim to egg cell. Therefore, these plants require water in the form of dew or rain for sexual reproduction. On the other hand, gymnosperms and angiosperms have special method for carrying their sperms to egg cell. They do not need water for reproduction. In the life cycle of plant, two different generations alternate with each other. One generation is diploid and produce spore. It is called sporophyte generation. The other generation is haploid and produce gamete. It is called gametophyte generation. The phenomena in which two different generations alternate with each other during life cycle is known as alternation of generation. In most plant, sporophyte generation is dominant. It means that it is big in size and is independent. Sporophyte produce haploid spores by meiosis. The spore develop into gametophyte. It is small in size and depend upon sporophyte. It produces gametes by mitosis. The male and female gamete fuse and form diploid zygote. The zygote undergoes repeated mitosis and develop into a new diploid sporophyte. Now look at this diagram. You have a sporophyte that is diploid. And this generation undergo a process that is called meiosis and produce haploid spore. These spores after mitosis produce a generation that is called gametophyte. And these gametophyte produce male and female gamete cell, egg and sperms. And these egg and sperm unite together after fertilization produce zygote that is also diploid, and zygote undergo further mitosis and produce sporophyte generation. So plant alternate one generation with the other generation, and that is why it is called alternation of generation. Sexual reproduction in flowering plants. We have discussed the different classes of plants. First is angiosperm, gymnosperms, mosses, and ferns. So today we discuss sexual reproduction in flowering plants mean angiosperms. What is a flowering plant? Flowering plants are the dominant plant form on land and they reproduce by sexual means. Often their most distinguished feature is their reproductive organ commonly called flowers. Flowering plant, also called angiosperm, use a sexual mode of reproduction. Reproduction in which plant mainly revolve around the flower, which has both the male and the female gametes. All the parts of the flower aid in the process of reproduction, although some of them are sterile. To understand about sexual reproduction, we need to look through its reproductive organ, that is flower. So, we discussed the structure of flower. Look at this diagram. Flower is the reproductive part of the plant. Flower has four main whorls. First is sepal. They are green in color, and the group of sepal is known as calyx. After that, there are colorful petals are present, and these group of petals are known as corolla. The male part of the flower is called stamen, and stamen has two parts, anther and filament. And the female part is called carpel. and it has three main parts: stigma, style, and ovary. This is also the diagram of the flower. You have different parts of the flower, and you can see stigma, style, ovary, ovules, anther, filament. एंड एंथर के अंदर क्या प्रेजेंट होते हैं? पोलन ग्रेन्स प्रेजेंट होते हैं, और एंथर और फिलामेंट को कंबाइन हम क्या कहते हैं? स्टेमन कहते हैं. इसी तरह स्टिग्मा, स्टाइल एंड ओवरी को पिस्टल कहा जाता है या कार्पल कहा जाता है. ग्रीन लीफ लाइक स्ट्रक्चर को हम सेपल कहते हैं, और पेटल्स प्रेजेंट हैं. Flowers part and function. Flower consists of the following parts. First is the calyx, commonly known as sepal. These leaf-like structure protect the flower when it develops from a bud. Corolla. These are the bright and colorful petals of the flower which attract insect and bird, who are the agent of pollination. Next is the androecium, male part of the flower, which is also called stamen. It is the male reproductive flower parts, also known as stamen. Stamen consists of two parts, anther and filament. Anther is the four-looped sac-like structure responsible for pollen formation. These filaments are basically thread-like structures attached to the anther, and they keep the anther in place. Gynoecium is also known as carpel or pistil. It is the female reproductive part of the flower, and carpel are made up of three further parts, that is ovary, stigma, and style. Ovary is the chamber where ovules or egg are stored waiting for fertilization. Stigma is attached to the top of the carpel where the pollen from other flower, and style is a tubular structure that connects the ovary and the stigma. It is responsible for the transportation of pollen from the stigma to the ovary and holding the stigma in place. Third part of the flower, that is the male part of the flower, is also called androecium. Is the male reproductive part of flower. Its units are called stamen. Each stamen has a thread-like filament at the free end of which anther is attached. Another anther has pollen sac in which haploid microspores. Pollen grains are produced through meiosis. Each microspore germinates into male reproductive generation. During it, the nucleus of microspore undergo mitosis and produces two nuclei, that is a tube nucleus and a generative nucleus. The generative nucleus again undergo mitosis and produce two spumps. So a germinated microspore has a tube nucleus and two spumps. All these structures are the male reproductive generation of the plant. The fourth word is gynoecium, is the female reproductive part of flower. Its units are called carpel or pistil. Each carpel is made up of basal ovary, middle style, and upper stigma. Inside ovary, there are one to many ovules. Inside each ovule, one haploid macrospore is produced through meiosis. Macrospore germinate into the female gametophyte generation. During it, macrospore undergo mitosis and produce an egg cell and some associated structure, that is called fusion nucleus. Egg cell and associated structure are the female gametophyte generation of plant. Sexual reproduction in flowering plant involves the production of male and female gametes. The transfer of the male gamete to the female ovules in a process called pollination. After pollination occurs, fertilization happens and the ovule grow into seed within a fruit. After the seed are ready for dispersal, the fruit ripen, and by various means the seed are freed from the fruit, and after varying amount of time and under specific condition, the seed germinate and grow into the next generation. The anther produce male gametophyte, which are pollen grain which attract the stigma on the top of the carpel, in which the female gametophyte inside ovules are located. After the pollen tube grow through the carpel style, the sperms from the pollen grain migrate into the ovule to the fertilized the egg cell and central cell within the female gametophyte in a process termed as double fertilization. The resulting zygote develop into an embryo, while the triploid endosperms, one sperm, egg cell plus a binucleate female cell and a female tissues of the ovule give rise to the surrounding tissues in the developing seed. The ovary which produce the female gametophyte then grow into a fruit which surround the seed. Plant may either self-pollinate or cross-pollinate. Next topic is pollination. Pollination is the process where mature pollens are transferred to the stigma for the purpose of sexual reproduction in flowering plant. It can happen in two ways: cross-pollination and self-pollination. If pollens from the flower of one plant land on the stigma of another flower of a different plant, it is called cross-pollination. Birds, bee, insect, and the wind are some of the agents of cross-pollination. If the pollen of a flower is transferred to its own ovary, it is known as self-pollination or fertilization. Just look at the diagram of self-pollination. The pollen grain of the same flower fall on the stigma of the same flower, and this is called self-pollination. Self-pollination is when pollen from the same flower goes at the stigma of the flower in flowering plant or at the ovule in gymnosperm. There are two types of self-pollination. In autogamy, pollen is transferred to the stigma of the same flower. Pollen is transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower of the same flowering plant or from microsporangium to ovule within a single monoecious gymnosperm. Some plants have mechanisms that ensure autogamy, such as flowers that do not open or stamens that move to come into contact with. In cross pollination, just look at this diagram. In cross pollination, pollen grains stick to the legs of insect, and when these insects visit another flower, they drop the pollen grain on the stigma of another flower. So in this way, this type of pollination is called cross pollination. There is a difference between a insect pollinated flower or wind pollinated flower. The size of the flower should be generally large in insect pollinated flower and generally small in wind pollinated flower. Color of petals should be bright, and in wind pollinated flower, petal green or dull in color. Insect pollinated flower produce nectar, wind pollinated flower do not produce nectar. Insect pollinated flower face upward, wind pollinated flowers hang down for easy shaking. Insect pollinated flower enclosed inside ring of the petal. Stamen and stigma of wind pollinated flower hang out of ring of petal. Pollen grain of insect pollinated flowers are small in size, heavy and sticky, and wind pollinated flowers have pollen grain large in number, light and smooth surface. Stigma of the insect pollinated flower is pinhead, while stigma of the wind pollinated flower is feathery branches or for catching pollen. Your diary is learn this topic and draw the diagram of the structure of flower and also the self-pollination and cross-pollination. Thank you very much. Hope you understand this topic. Allah Hafiz.